When it comes to 8-bit video games of the third generation of consoles, you can't often say that comprehensive animation was something they were strong at. But then when you had to work with the amount of space available which even a blank Word document can't even shrink down to, you're going to have to come up with some very basic workarounds in portraying your character movement. When it comes to animation, particularly run or walk cycles, you have to have a minimum amount of frames in order to convince your eye that there's any movement at all. In animation, keyframes are used to rough out a movement so you can see where the strongest poses are. In this example, your keyframes for a walk cycle will be on the up and down movements. You'll then fill in the frames between these keyframes, called Inbetweens, and the motion will gradually look smoother depending on your frame rate, which is how many frames are shown in 1 second. But your strongest frames are always the keyframes, which act as the foundation for the structure of your animation. While games in the 16-bit era were able to pull this off with some finesse, limited memory in the cartridges during the 8-bit era meant Inbetweens were sacrificed, leaving you with, essentially, keyframes. This is why Mega Man's run is made up of a mere 3 frames. This is why Mario has 1 frame for jumping, and this is why the Turtles had 2 frames for climbing a ladder. If you're going to portray a movement in as fewer frames as possible, you're going to use the strongest poses. In Mega Man's case, you don't necessarily notice that he only has 3 frames, because your eyes fool you into thinking there was movement between those frames as they happen so quickly. This is also the case with Mario's run, particularly in Super Mario 2, which has an impressive 2 frames of animation for running, and it looks fine, because that's all it needs. It's not necessarily the case that adding more frames enhances the animation either. If we look at the same run cycle for Mega Man in the Wily Wars, which is a 16-bit remake of the first 3 NES games, we can see that the movement doesn't really appear as strong or dynamic. It certainly adds a bit more life to the movement, but the in-betweens are so close to the keyframes, it softens the impact of those poses, making them look dynamically weaker. So it actually worked to the designer's favour having to work in such a limited capacity. Some first-party NES games had that close-up artwork of 8-bit sprites for the cover, and had that one of Mario falling to his death in his jumping pose. Just this 1 frame alone portrays 90% of the action, and this has always been the case with Mario in almost every iteration. Once you press that jump button, he is immediately in that air-punching pose, because in the end, it's the strongest, most dynamic frame. Nintendo didn't mess around with adding in unnecessary in-between frames before that 1 strong keyframe. Now, when you look at jumping in Mega Man 8 for the PS1, there are 8 frames before that 1 strong keyframe, and it makes the movement appear incredibly sluggish and weak. Indeed, this is the case for much of Mega Man 8's animation, and probably subconsciously adds to the people's view of the general design of the game. That's not to say the animation is incorrect, but it doesn't give the movement much energy or excitement. So considering this, viewing the 8-bit animation keyframes certainly appears more exciting and dynamic, as it cuts out any in-betweens for the sake of smoother movement. You'll often find 16-bit games had gloriously animated run cycles, making full use of more disk space to fit the animation in. Although you might sometimes find some 16-bit games has stuck to that bare-bones keyframe animation to give a more energetic movement, such as both Mario Worlds, which share the design from Super Mario Bros. 2. Retro-styled indie games in the last 8 or 9 years have a bit of a mixed bag in the understanding of this keyframe animation. Some really tighten this design philosophy in a vice and you get some gorgeously animated indies, while some merely reference the style from the era without fully grasping the idea of dynamic poses. This doesn't necessarily mean that one game is better looking than another, but you might be able to feel the difference. So when we look at the spectrum of this keyframe animation across the 8-bit era, you'll begin noticing patterns and techniques in portraying movement and action in as few frames as possible. For instance, all these run cycles use 3 frames, but some go back and forth and some loop. Some are fast and some are slow. and you get a different result each time, all just from 3 frames. Like the brilliant Adam Neely has said of facing a creative block, limitation breeds creativity, and I think this also applies to 8-bit animation. Video game artist Keith Warrington said this of being shackled by the limitations of 2-color 8x8 squares of pixels when designing the character animation for School Days for the ZX Spectrum. You couldn't do a normal person because they would have all looked the same. There had to be a little bald round-headed teacher with specs, one needed to be a smarmy bloke with a moustache, another was bound to be an Open University guy, all beard, just so you could tell them apart really. This helps reinforce the idea of being concise when animating on a small scale, while trying to be inventive. As an example in animation, children's TV show Pocoyo focuses heavily on this quick, snappy energy, using a limited number of frames and some movements to give a real high-paced, entertaining piece of animation. Personally, I feel this is infinitely more interesting than some other cheap and easy kids animation. Anyway, before I wrap up, I'd like to take a look at some exceptional examples of animation in 8-bit games. Interestingly, these first 3 examples all share the same technique: rotoscoping. Rotoscoping is using real-life reference footage as a base for your animation, and it's the reason games like Prince of Persia look so accomplished. Prince of Persia, Impossible Mission, and Karateka all have some top-notch animation, making as much use as they can with as many frames as possible, giving a realistic sense of movement. This sort of animation was, again, carried over successfully into the 16-bit era with games like Flashback, but it's interesting to note that the same effect can be achieved on a lesser system. Next, I'd like to showcase just how Bloomin Marvelous the animation is in Little Samson. On the surface, it still has basic keyframes in run cycles and jumping, but every character has a complete rotation animation, and Little Samson jumps with a spin. I don't actually know if that is Little Samson himself, I wasn't really paying attention to any story. And this isn't particularly common in 8-bit games to have a full rotation, and it's just such finesse. Finally, Batman for the NES has some really nice animations for a NES game. Nearly every action feels really considered. When you punch, Batman pulls back ever so lightly and quickly in anticipation, much like how he jumps. When you jump, he'll crouch first and then leap, quite different to how many other game characters jump. Enemies pull out weapons with a few frames of animation and have some reaction to actions. But the cutest little touch is how Batman's cape has some follow-through animation when he moves and jumps, lingering on after he's stopped moving. It's only a frame or two, but it really makes the difference. And I'd like to just take this opportunity to quickly compare Batman to Robocop and just how different their movements are. I mean, I know Robocop is part robot, but most of the animation in this game is erratic and poorly planned and stiff, and has an inconsistent energy about it. I mean, what the heck is that? So when anyone says old games look bad, just say, "No, don't, shut up!" and walk away. Please consider sharing and rating this video, commenting your thoughts, and if you like these videos and want to keep up to date, you can subscribe and bell, and follow me on Twitter for updates and such. Love you, bye.